Picture this. You are standing at the edge of a canyon in southeastern Wyoming. The year is 1868. The ground drops 150 feet beneath your boots into a narrow gorge where a creek no wider than your arm cuts through solid granite. Behind you, 1,000 miles of freshly laid railroad track stretches back toward Omaha. Ahead of you, California. And between you and California is this hole in the earth that the Union Pacific Railroad must cross, or the entire transcontinental project dies right here on Sherman Summit. There is no steel. There is no concrete. There are no cranes, no hydraulic lifts, no power tools of any kind. There is pine timber hauled by ox-drawn wagons across the Great Plains. There are hand tools. And there are men, mostly Irish immigrants and Civil War veterans, who have 85 days to build a wooden bridge 650 feet long and 150 feet above the canyon floor. A bridge that will carry 60-ton locomotives through winds so fierce they can push empty boxcars off the rails and into the rocks below. On April 23, 1868, that bridge was finished. Engineer Samuel Reed stood at the edge of the gorge and watched the first locomotive crawl across at 4 miles per hour, while the entire structure swayed in the Wyoming wind. The bridge flexed, the timbers groaned, and it held. 2 carpenters had already fallen to their deaths during the final rush to shore up the framing. Nobody recorded their names. I have spent weeks going through the old construction records, the photographs, the engineering reports filed with the Union Pacific. What those men built across the American West between the 1860s and 1900 was not supposed to work. Wooden bridges taller than anything Europe had ever attempted, assembled with axes and rope in mountain passes where winter came early and stayed late. And yet, at the peak of timber bridge construction, over 1,000 of these structures carried locomotives across canyons, rivers, and valleys, from Wyoming to Washington State. None of the tallest ones survive today, but the photographs prove they existed, and the records tell you exactly what it cost to build them, not just in money, in fingers, in lives, in men who were buried near the structures they helped raise and then forgotten within a generation. This is that story. To understand why America built wooden trestle bridges, you have to understand the problem the railroads faced after the Civil War. The eastern half of the country was relatively flat. You could lay track across the plains and prairies at a pace of several miles per day. But west of the Missouri River, the terrain changed. The Rocky Mountains, the Cascades, the Sierra Nevada. These were not gentle hills. They were walls of stone and timber, cut through by hundreds of canyons, gorges, and river valleys that dropped anywhere from 50 to 300 feet below the grade line the railroad needed. Every canyon that could not be crossed was a railroad that could not be built. Going around a canyon might add 30, 50, sometimes 80 miles of additional track, plus the cost of grading a new route through terrain that fought you at every turn. The math was simple. If you wanted to connect the East Coast to the West Coast by rail, you had to go straight across those canyons. And the only material available in sufficient quantity, at a cost the railroad companies could stomach, was wood. Steel was expensive, difficult to transport, and required specialized fabrication that simply did not exist in remote mountain camps. Stone took years to quarry and lay. But timber was everywhere. The forests of the Pacific Northwest, the mountain slopes of Montana, the pine stands of Wyoming. You could fell a tree within sight of the canyon you needed to cross, square it with an adze, and have it ready for the bridge crew by afternoon. The entire logic of the wooden trestle was built on this one fact. The material was right there, standing in the forest around you, waiting to be turned into something that could hold a locomotive. The engineering principle behind these bridges was the bent. If you have never heard that word in this context, think of it as a single vertical frame, like the letter A without the crossbar, or more accurately, like a row of posts braced together with diagonal timbers to form one rigid unit. Each bent was a self-contained leg of the bridge. You built one, raised it into position, then built the next one 12 to 16 feet away, and connected them across the top with horizontal stringers and planking that carried the rails. For shorter trestles, under 50 feet, crews used pile bents. These were round timber poles, 3 to 5 per bent, driven straight into the ground with a steam-powered pile driver. The outer poles were angled slightly outward for stability, maybe 5 or 10 degrees. Once the piles were in the ground, the crew cut the tops level, bolted on a cap beam, and laid the stringers. A basic pile trestle over a creek could go up in days. But for the tall ones, the ones that had to reach 100, 150, 200 feet into the air, pile driving was not enough. You cannot pound a round log 200 feet into the earth and expect it to hold. For these monsters, the builders used frame bents. Square-cut timbers, 12 inches by 12 inches or larger, assembled into rigid frames that were built in stories. Each story was 10 to 15 feet tall. Think of it like stacking boxes. You would build the first story flat on the ground, bolt it together with iron drift pins, then raise it into position. Then you would build the second story on top of the first, then the third, then the fourth. For a 200-foot trestle, you might stack 15 or 16 stories before you reach the deck where the rails would sit. The physics of it seem impossible until you see how the bracing worked. Every bent was cross-braced with diagonal X patterns on both sides, turning each frame into a rigid triangle that could transfer the vertical load of a locomotive down through the structure and into the ground. The diagonal bracing was not decorative. It was the entire reason the bridge stood. Without it, a 200-foot column of stacked timber would buckle under its own weight, let alone the weight of a train. Now here is where it gets extraordinary. For the tallest trestles, the individual bent sections were assembled flat on the ground, then lifted into place using a system called a highline. Imagine a heavy cable strung across the canyon from one rim to the other, anchored to trees or rock on both sides. A block and tackle hung from the cable, operated by a crew of men and sometimes a horse or mule on one end. The bent section, weighing several hundred pounds of freshly cut timber and iron, was hooked to the line, hauled out over the canyon, and lowered into position on top of the growing structure below. Then the next section was assembled, hauled out, and fitted on top of the one before it. If you have ever seen a photograph of one of these operations, it looks like madness. Men standing on platforms 150 feet in the air, with nothing between them and the canyon floor but the timber they just bolted together. No safety nets, no harnesses, no fall protection of any kind. The only thing keeping a man alive at that height was his grip, his balance, and the skill of the crew operating the high line above him. The workers who built these structures were not trained bridge engineers. Most of them were immigrant laborers, Scandinavians primarily, Norwegians, Swedes, Finns, men who had grown up building timber barns and farmhouses in the old country and brought those skills across the Atlantic. On the Northern Pacific and Great Northern Railways, the timber crews were overwhelmingly Nordic. They knew wood. They understood how grain runs, how a load distributes through a joint, how much you can ask of a bolt before the fibers around it start to crush. That knowledge was not learned from textbooks. It was learned from building, from watching, from years of working with their hands in cold weather on structures that would kill them if they got the joinery wrong. A framer on a trestle crew in the 1880s earned about $1.75 a day. For that wage, he was expected to work 10 to 12 hours, 6 days a week, in conditions that ranged from suffocating summer heat to winter cold that made iron tools painful to grip. The work was relentless. Every timber had to be hand-squared with a broadaxe or adze. Every hole for a drift pin had to be bored with a hand auger, a T-shaped tool you turned by brute force. Every 18-inch iron drift pin had to be driven through the aligned holes with a sledgehammer until the joint was tight enough to hold under load. And every one of these operations happened on a platform in the sky, often in wind, sometimes in rain, always with the canyon waiting below. The drift pins deserve a moment here because they were the connective tissue of every wooden trestle ever built. An iron rod, roughly 3/4 of an inch in diameter and 18 inches long, tapered to a blunt point on one end. You bored a hole slightly smaller than the pin, aligned your timbers, and hammered the pin through both pieces. The friction of iron against green wood created a joint that was remarkably strong. No nuts, no bolts, no threads. Just iron forced into wood by a man swinging a sledgehammer on a platform with no railing, 150 feet above a river. The danger was constant, and the deaths were real. At the Dale Creek Bridge in Wyoming, 2 carpenters died in falls during the final days of construction in April 1868. On the Northern Pacific Line through Montana, avalanches, collapses, and equipment failures claimed lives that were recorded in payroll ledgers as simply discharged deceased. The men who fell were usually buried near the work site, in graves marked with wooden crosses that rotted within a decade. The records from this period are frustratingly thin on individual names. The railroads tracked tonnage and mileage with obsessive precision. They did not extend the same courtesy to the men who made those numbers possible. What is documented is the scale. Between the 1860s and 1900, timber trestles made up 1 to 3% of the total length of the average American railroad. That may sound like a small number until you consider how many miles of track were laid in that period. We are talking about hundreds, possibly over 1,000 major wooden trestle bridges built across the western United States alone. The Northern Pacific, the Great Northern, the Union Pacific, the Central Pacific, the Southern Pacific, the logging railroads of Washington and Oregon. Every one of them relied on timber trestles to cross terrain that would have stopped the railroad cold without them. And some of these structures were staggering in their dimensions. The Dale Creek Bridge, finished in 1868, was 650 feet long and 150 feet high, the longest and tallest bridge on the entire Union Pacific line. The 2 Medicine Creek trestle on the Great Northern Railway in Montana rose 214 feet above the valley floor, a wall of squared timber taller than a 20-story building. The Cedar River logging trestle in Washington state stood 203 feet high and stretched 843 feet across the valley, photographed around 1917 by Darius Kinsey in an image that still stops people cold. Built in 2 stories of single vertical poles, each about 100 feet long, it was constructed by the Pacific States Lumber Company to haul timber out of the forests of King County, and the largest wood frame trestle ever recorded, crossing West Canyon Creek at mile 87.9, was 750 feet long and 182 feet high, turning the rail line nearly 90 degrees across the head of the canyon. None of these structures exist anymore. Not one. The reason is built into the material itself. Untreated timber exposed to weather lasts about 20 years before decay weakens it past the point of safety. Locomotives with hot fireboxes rolling across wooden decking were a constant fire risk. Collapses on logging railroads were so common that train crews developed a grim routine. When approaching a high trestle they did not trust, the men would hop off the slow-moving locomotive, let it cross on its own, then sprint across the bridge and jump back on once it reached the other side. That was not folklore. That was standard practice on dozens of logging lines in the Pacific Northwest. The wind was another enemy. At Dale Creek, the Wyoming gales were so severe that the Union Pacific had to anchor the bridge to the canyon walls with guy wires. Even with the cables, the structure swayed enough that locomotive engineers refused to cross at anything faster than 4 miles per hour. Some refused to stay in the cab at all, walking alongside the engine on the deck while it crept across. An Omaha newspaper called the bridge a miracle of modern engineering in 1868. The men who actually crossed it called it terrifying. But here is what should stay with you. Despite all of that, the bridges held. They held long enough to get the railroads across the mountains. They held long enough to open the West to settlement, to commerce, to the industrial expansion that built the modern United States. Every ton of freight that crossed the Rockies before 1900 crossed on wood. Every passenger who traveled from Chicago to Portland or San Francisco sat in a rail car that rolled over trestles assembled by men with hand tools and iron pins. By the 1890s and into the early 1900s, steel and concrete began replacing timber on the major rail lines. The economics had shifted. Steel was cheaper to produce, easier to transport, and lasted decades longer than wood. One by one, the great timber trestles came down. Some were replaced by steel bridges on the same piers. Some were bypassed entirely when the railroads regraded their routes to avoid the canyons altogether. The Dale Creek Bridge was dismantled in 1901 when the Union Pacific rerouted its line 3 miles to the south. The Two Medicine Creek timber trestle was replaced by a steel structure that still carries BNSF freight trains today. The logging trestles of Washington and British Columbia were simply abandoned once the forests they served had been logged out. The lumber companies considered those bridges disposable infrastructure, a means of extracting timber from a mountainside and nothing more. Once the trees were gone, the trestles were left to rot. And that is perhaps the hardest part of this story. Not just that the bridges are gone, but that the men who built them vanished from memory along with the structures. The payroll records list wages paid and days worked. The engineering reports describe dimensions, load capacities, timber grades. But the names of the framers, the drift pin drivers, the highline operators who dangled bent sections over 200-foot canyons, those names are almost entirely lost. We know they were there because the photographs show them, tiny figures standing on platforms in the sky, dwarfed by the wooden giants they were assembling with their hands. If you have ever driven across a modern concrete highway bridge and felt perfectly safe, perfectly bored, perfectly indifferent to the engineering beneath your tires, consider this. There was a time, not all that long ago, when crossing a canyon meant trusting your life to a structure built from trees that were standing in the forest 6 months earlier. Built by men earning less than $2 a day. Built without safety equipment, without power tools, without any of the technology we take for granted. And those bridges held. They swayed in the wind, they groaned under the weight of locomotives, they terrified everyone who crossed them. But they held. That is a kind of confidence, in material, in craft, in sheer physical labor, that does not exist in the same way anymore. And it deserves to be remembered. Not as nostalgia, not as some quaint chapter in the history of American infrastructure, but as a testament to what human hands and human knowledge can accomplish when the only option is to build something that should be impossible and make it stand. The granite piers from the original Dale Creek Bridge are still there in southeastern Wyoming, standing in a field 4 miles west of the Ames Monument. The wooden trestle and the iron replacement are both long gone, but the hand-cut stone foundations remain, fitted without mortar, holding their position after more than 150 years of Wyoming weather. If you stand between them and look down into the gorge, you can still see the proportions of the thing. You can feel how high the deck must have been. You can hear the wind that made locomotive engineers refuse to ride in their own cabs. And if you stay long enough, you might start to understand what it took to build a bridge across that gap, with nothing but timber and iron and the kind of nerve that doesn't get taught in engineering school. The wood is gone. The men are gone. But the canyon is still there, and it is still 150 feet deep, and it still asks the same question it asked in 1868. How do you get across? They answered it with trees, and the answer worked.